Awesome. I'd like POIs in chat, please. That would be fantastic. All right. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Just like in debate, where if you say everyone else is totally crazily wrong and you run extreme arguments that no one actually believes, that doesn't work out too well. And we think the same thing is true of political discourse. A bit of framing. What does the narrative of political centrism look like that we defend? It looks like a large majority of parties being ideologically moderate in their policy agendas. It looks like the glorification of bipartisanship and the view of political compromise as virtuous, and the large-scale expectation of parties and elites within parties to conform to those norms. What is the counterfactual Ob likely defends? Intuitively, it's probably something of a hybrid in the sense that you have a mix of centrist parties and centrist ideologies in addition to the existence of more extreme or radical views which are tolerated more so in the political atmosphere. Obviously, extremes exist on either side of the house, so it's not the case under our side that we just magically poof, vanish, make like white supremacy go away. The question is, how are those extremes viewed? The narrative of political centrism, when dominant as happens under our side, is one which necessarily opposes that type of extremism, views that extremism is politically illegitimate, offers less media coverage to those policies, and it often means that those parties don't get included in coalitions and don't get power under our side of the house. 3 contributions then at opening government. First, on political discourse. Second, on facilitating policymaking. And finally, on vulnerable groups. First argument on political discourse. Opposition might choose to make arguments in this debate about what effects this will have on certain ends of the political spectrum, like, for example, leftist parties. But no one in this room actually knows what the objectively best set of policies are. And the best and most important duty of any democracy is to aggregate the popular preferences to best approximate what we collectively believe to be good policy, in as much as we must defer to individual people who live under the tyranny of the state. Under our side of the house, states are better at that. Why? Because under our side, political discourse and political rhetoric is moderated. Most parties appeal to broad coalitions of voters and have little incentive to appeal to very fringe individual voters who want to hear extremist rhetoric. The norm in political discourse is one of compromise, of understanding that others have legitimate perspectives. It's a narrative that says that polarizing political discourse is bad. What does this mean? Under our side, it's much more likely that people become involved in political discourse. Gut check, huge numbers of people under status quo never engage in political discourse or simply abandon politics altogether or don't vote because they hate the fact it's so polarizing and dominated by the extremes, even if they're a small part of the political spectrum. Under our side of the house, those people's voices are more likely to be included. Furthermore, we're more likely under our side to limit the issue of things like echo chambers or people becoming increasingly radical over time. Often, the reason why people become more radical is as response to the other ends of the radical fringes. So people on the far right, for example, are often vindicated and then double down on their extremism because of the dominance or the power of far left political parties like Syriza in Greece, for example. In fact, a large number of the very far right Zionist nationalist parties in Israel are a direct response to very powerful secular leftist parties in Israel. Under our side, we limit that and therefore make people's views more moderate on politics and encourage more people's voices to become involved. That means in the long run, we get a better aggregation of popular preferences and the way that people vote, the way that people talk about politics, the way that we share political opinions with other people. This is the overriding principal duty of democracy, and we better fulfill it. Second argument, a bit more tangible. Why do we get better policymaking under our side of the house? 3 ways this happens. 1, intuitively, governments are far more efficient under our side. That's because in the absence of the narrative that says political centrism is so vital, parties do not want to look weak or like they're compromising on their values, and emerging party members want to gain a comparative advantage over other rising politicians in that party by looking even less willing to compromise with the other side, which you often demonize as evil or outlandish. But under our side, it's more likely that compromise is seen as virtuous, that parties benefit when they engage in political horse trading, negotiate with other parties, and enter into coalitions. That means under our side, policy is probably passed far more efficiently because compromise is something which happens more commonly and is more of a norm and indeed expectation in politics. But secondly, stability is better under our side of the house. Why? Intuitively, broad-based parties that appeal to moderate values are just much more likely to be broad in the scope in the sense that they're appealing to lots of people, which means that under their side of the house, when radical politics isn't the dominant norm, of course, but is still relatively more powerful, in lots of instances, you end up getting very fragmented politics on their side of the house when many different radical parties, like, for example, exists in countries like Israel, compete for very small voter blocks. You often get very unstable governments where one very small far-right party in Spain with 2% of the vote can shift the coalition. Under our side of the House, though, even when coalitions still get built, they're more likely to stay and remain stable because the act of staying in a coalition and compromising, even with parties that you disagree with, is more of a political norm. Why is political stability and efficiency good? It means that we get a faster government response to things like crises, but more importantly, it limits political volatility. And that volatility is often the starting point for strongman leaders like Netanyahu, for example, to rise to power on the narrative of the status quo has failed to give you stability and I will provide that. So under our side, democratic backsliding is less likely in that regard. Lastly, under this argument, extremism is terrible for politics. Why? It is definitionally self-fulfilling. As one side becomes more extreme, the other side does too. And that means that as politics becomes more and more extremized, you get less and less productive governance. Because when one government comes into power, it implements relatively more radical measures, which are immediately then revoked by the successive government, which is a form of backlash against that prior radical government. Under our side, that type of constant sort of like self-fulfilling prophecy of extremism is less likely to happen. Before I also explain what we better represent democratic preferences, I'll take CO if they have anything.
Yeah, your absolute best case is that you pass some more policy. I'm unclear why this is better, the point where like your parties also become more mainstream and less representative to some extent.
Yeah, I'll deal with that right now. So why do we get better representation under our side of the House? The important thing to note is under our side of the House, parties are not monoliths. Even if the party writ large appeals to a large number of people to appear moderate, it still has the incentive to appeal to a wide range of voters. And interestingly, here's why we get better representation under our side of the House. Two reasons. One, we get better buy-in to democratic institutions, especially in emerging democracies, which is a precondition for any of the debate about democracy to occur. Why? The nature of extremism is that it is often anti-establishment. The way you message extremism is that there is a group of people trying to silence us that we need to oppose, which is often the establishment and often the existing in government and political institutions. That type of fiery democratic rhetoric, which you see in places like the BJP in India, is less likely. But also, and more importantly, under our side of the House, we get better representation because on their side, small parties are probably more of a norm because they appeal to very small fringes. The problem then becomes that very small radical parties are often the kingmaker in coalitions, exactly what happened in Germany, for example, where a far-right party was able to come to power, not because they won 30% of the vote, but because they won 15% of the vote. That is less likely under our side of the House because you now have moderate parties appealing to a broader range of people. And lastly, this is much better for marginalized groups who are often the target and the scapegoats of extremist rhetoric, which can in many instances increase on-the-ground violence against them. The end point is we get better democratic politics and principle fulfillment we propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for that very fine speech, and I call upon the Leader of the Opposition to open the case for off-bench. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I audible and visible? Okay. I'll try to take a POI from closing. So just POI me through chat, but don't verbally interrupt me. Speech will start in 3, 2, 1. We think the narrative and the normalization of political centrism as an excuse to oppose extremism is specifically the issue, because the narrative of what we conceive as normal or what we conceive as centrist is often a hidden way for like right-wing policies to get in power and a lot of bad things to happen for minorities. I'm going to do 2 sets of rebuttals before running into arguments. First, let's talk about like OG's discourse argument. I think the impact of this is likely to be marginal at best, because in the absence of centrists, presumably the left and right wing also become less extreme because they have a larger demographic of people they need to cater towards. And so they're more likely to try to meet in the middle more often, or they're likely to change these ideologies in a way that is more appealing to the general audience, because a lot of these like people are not like taken away by the moderate or centrist party anymore. And I'll explain why this happens down in my speech as well. But the second thing they talk about in the last like 10 seconds of their speech is like regarding minorities, on how, you know, somehow centrist parties are really, really good for minorities. I think this argument just lacks significant mechanism on how this happens, or just characterization on why centrist framings lead to these types of impacts. And I'll be proving in my argumentation why this is the direct opposite. So firstly, let's talk about why political centrism favors status quo and deters reform. And then second, I'll talk about why we get better political discourse accountability, which is the stepping stone into getting democracy in the first place. Firstly, and most importantly, let's talk about why political centrism favors status quo and deters reforms. I have 4 mechanisms as to why status quo is bad. And the underlying like logic here is that like the way in which we perceive political centrism and status quo is often very conservative, and that's considered normal. There's 4 mechanisms as to why this is the case. First, we think governments were often historically conservative, especially post-colonial areas where constitutions were made by colonizers after getting colonized in the past, and a lot of countries still have to abide by these constitutions by the nature that they're having like by the nature of like legal systems, and that they have to like make laws that are precedent of this constitution. So a lot of these constitutions are created through things like religious beliefs or old conservative values like post-war, post-colonization. And a lot of these ideologies are still very prominent in like politics. And this is very historically what is considered as normal, because a lot of people have had exposure to these ideologies through mechanisms like constitutions and legal education. Secondly, I think a lot of traditional values and family beliefs that we have within society that are also considered normal empower conservatism, like gender roles where men are generally considered men are generally considered leaders within the family, and women are told to go work, or we're generally like thought that like, oh, poor people and rich people, it's okay for them to live in different areas. The us versus you mentality, these are also things that are very prominent within society that bolster these ideologies that are conservative. Thirdly, I think the like political interventionship has happened a lot in a lot of like different countries around the world, where the US and the UK intervene into other countries and like put their like conservative ideology onto them. US has done like 60 like political interventions in the past year. These often support radical parties that are damaging and that are actively harming minorities and suppress individuals. This is often becomes very ingrained into people's education systems. Like the US funds extremist schools in Turkey and the Middle East and teach children and ingrain extremist ideologies into them all the time. Last mechanism, a lot of media representation says the left is really extreme and portrays them in a way that is really, really terrible. Notice a lot of countries like the US tend to be bipartisan, and we see a lot of this polarization and misrepresentation happening in media in these areas. This is really important analysis because it deals a lot with what OG tells you. The things most people frame as extreme and status quo are right-leaning, and this is actively harmful. And there's a lot of negative aspects to this. This responds to one, their argument about democracy, just because the things that we consider normal and status quo are very right-leaning, and that often is actively harmful to democracy because it makes people make bad decisions of their life. But secondly, this is a prerequisite to their argument. Status quo is extreme because of current trends of polarization and normalization of extremist parties in the first place. Why then is this bad? 2 harms. 1, I think this often just means that like these bad ideologies become more prominent, often anti-minority, progression poor, really bad for minorities. But secondly, specifically making these ideologies considered normal and centrist in status quo as a dominant political ideology is really, really bad. Because 1, it becomes harder to identify what is good and bad and what is moderate. The definition and line between what is progressive and what is not becomes really blurry, which also means discourse surrounding political change, discourse surrounding what we want to do in the future and what type of reforms are good for people, what we define as extreme, what we ought to censor in speech becomes really, really blurry. But secondly, this also creates a lot of minority suppression. What moderates think we need to censor is often now actively bad for them. 1, on the practical, this means that a lot of policies are just likely to be bad for them because they're more right-wing. But secondly, regarding speech, it's hard for them to speak out in politics because white supremacist platforms and because it's a very white supremacist platform, and hate speeches around these areas are not trained, because what we would consider hate speech from a liberal view and a moderate view is often not considered hate speech. So you see a lot of things like anti-minority rhetoric. You see things like hate crime getting consistently normalized within these platforms because they're considered moderate policy, and it's considered too left-wing to try to ban these like things. This infringes on their right. There's a lot of social pressure in this sense. This leads to a lot of things like police brutality, anti-minority suppression, etc. Why then do we get reform on government? First, I think we are not legitimizing both sides of the aisle. We're not leaving it ambiguous on our side. We are not letting them treat it as equal value. We're saying that this is the right, this is the left, this is a certain starting point, this is like top down, or making it extremely clear who believes in what, which makes it easier to hold them accountable. Now you cannot just hide under the veil of saying you're moderate and saying racist or problematic things under that. You have to take accountability for what you support. If a centrist supports anti-immigration, you don't know who's responsible. If you identify them as a rightist, you can now hold that political party accountable for indoctrinating those ideas into their supporters, and specifically see what type of political ideologies are getting expressed by what type of politician. Before I move on, I'll take on closing.
If there's so many factors that frame the left in a country as being extreme, then surely political centrism, which actively encourages compromise and rehabilitation, helps to rehabilitate this image and therefore changes the problem that you complain about in the first place.
No, so we're saying that the problem rises like the reason why leftists are often viewed as so extremist is because of this idea of political moderatism that is often very favoring towards the right. This reform then is really important just because, one, they're really vulnerable, but secondly, this allows us to make large steps and large progressive steps into good directions, likely because of the trend of liberalism and liberalization. This is likely to mean really good things in regards to policy. The things that we've considered really weird, like anti-slavery in the past, are the type of radical policy changes that we want to make now. We want to like decrease hate speech. We want to do big radical policy changes that help like vulnerable individuals. Lastly, let's just quickly talk about politics. First, I already proved we get more constructive discourse because we get a clear identification of who believes in what and we can attribute blame properly. Secondly, I think this decreases polarization because moderates make leftists look really extreme. There's on the ground perception of what it looks like when people adopt it. A, either they participate in a lot of politics and are apathetic, or B, they're not participants of politics and therefore have no takes. If you give legitimacy to both sides and the type of narratives you push to your followers and citizens is that both are legitimate, then apathetic voters or apathetic voter groups that are important or niche identifiers of different groups don't get adopted or recognized. People view it as the state versus us rather than a certain party that supports me versus our opposition versus the state and the oppressors. So you get more of that like variety on our side. For all those reasons, vote OO.
I thank the leader of the opposition for their fine speech, and I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case on proposition.
Hi, sorry. Just to reiterate, I go by she, her pronouns, and I'll take POIs verbally. Okay. I'll firstly deal with the main OO contribution, which is that you frame right-wing ideologies as centrist and you frame left-wing ideologies as radical, and then I'll go on to everything else they have not responded to our case and why I'll show why it's winning. Firstly then, let's deal with their main contribution. I think we've already beaten this because on principle, we may agree that the left is good as debaters, but objectively, this just isn't the truth, because I don't blame OO for living in debate land and liberal bubbles, but I just want to note that right-wing policies aren't all right-wing supremacists. Like, it is regrettable that Trump has tainted the Republican Party to be immigrant hating and minority hating, but the reality is in the global context, a lot of right-wing parties are still relatively moderate. DeSantis is still relatively moderate. The fact that he still does certain immigration programs probably shows that it isn't as bad as what opposition wants to say, and more importantly, it isn't opposition's right to determine what people want. We give you a better principle as to how we better aggregate preferences on our side and why that's probably more important. But the second response under this is we get better outcomes for vulnerable groups because we challenge the premise that only the left can be good for vulnerable groups. The fact that now as an African American in the US, you are almost certainly not going to vote Republican. That situation is far worse on their side when you make it partisan. So we actually incentivize more parties to campaign on their behalf on our side of the house. When they try to cross party lines, when they're able to try to appeal to a greater voter base, it is far more likely that on our side of the house, minorities get catered to on all ends of the spectrum versus on their side of the house, when it is likely going to be exclusively the liberal and the left-wing parties that they want to talk about. Let's quickly now move on to this point on minorities. The value of this is, even if you don't believe on OG, we massively improve policy making, we eliminate the worst and the most harmful policies for minorities. So you reduce the risk of them getting scapegoated, them facing things like literal genocide and ethnic cleansing in certain countries. And this is a very concentrated and serious harm on a sizable population. We're not saying that on our side of the house, none of these harms exist, but comparatively, it is better and will be far worse on side opposition. So for OO to just go, no, but that exists in your status quo, it was not enough for them. It was a comparative and they had to deal with the other side of it. The reason as to why they're more likely to get scapegoated on their side when they're less likely on our side is because you're better able to view minorities as expendable when you're able to exclude a sizable amount of the population. And this is really important because often centrist rhetoric means you are unable able to very explicitly alienate or demonize a certain group of individuals. It is often significantly harder for you to justify when there's a centrist norm on our side, when on their side of the house, it is far better for you to justify this, when you're able to say that, but we are pushing for our people's interests and the interests of XYZ. It is far more easier for the general population to not be as guilty of it as well, and to support these policies. So on their side of the house, it's significantly more likely you are able to have these policies getting passed and for lots of more individuals to get harmed. The OO push to this is, but no, political centrism upholds the status quo, and that currently harms minorities. Note this is non-comparative on their side of the house. The response we have is, one, the problem with this argument is that it's zero-sum. So it's true that some extremists can be leftist or anti-colonial advocates, but an equal number of extremists are people like Marine Le Pen. And by the way, at best, extremism from the left is cancelled out by political extremism. Extremism from the left is cancelled out by political extremism on the right, and we can call it the far right by saying they aren't centrist. But furthermore, let's flip their claim. Those advocating for reform tend to be rather moderate. Why? Because the vast majority of social movements know that they cannot be too radical, or else they won't be able to change lots of people's minds. This means that progressives and those pushing for reform are often moderate on either side of the house, since they're pushing for more than just political change. That means vulnerable groups are actually better off under our side. They're glorified for their compromise exclusively on ours when they're not on side opposition. The second response is, actually, we think that political centrism is relatively good for leftists. People in conventional power structures often don't want to cooperate or work with people pushing for reform, but a narrative of centrism incentivizes those elites to cooperate, when often the comparative is they view their own positions of power a threat. Thirdly, this argument shouldn't be winning for O, even if they win it, because their argument is just people demonize the left as radical. But the reason they demonize the left as radical is to uphold the status quo. That incentive doesn't go away on their side. So the political right just finds any other number of ways to demonize the left. It is unclear why this is the only way they can do so. And remember, panel, all of our arguments about policymaking and democratic backsliding can still win under the OO metric. Why? Because these people who need efficient and effective state policymaking are those who rely the most heavily on the state, like groups who need welfare and the most vulnerable groups of people. So even if by the end of top half, OO convince you that the narrative of political centrism is bad for leftists, we can still outweigh their argument by getting better state policy in general, which mostly benefits these vulnerable groups. I'll take that POI.
Yeah,
Opening.
in the vast majority.
Closing.
In the vast majority of instances, obviously within the left, you have significant splits at the point where you don't have centrism. When you're more left, you create different splits within the left to accommodate for more political views within the opposition world.
No. Our argument just showed you that this argument goes both ways, right? We would rather prevent the worst forms of extremism, even if we can neuter some of the good levels of like radical lefts. First, let's quickly defend our arguments then. The first one is on political discourse. The value of this argument is what Ryan tells you, which is what is considered a good policy is relatively unclear. Let's illustrate this. For example, you may believe that strict laws are good because they can reduce crime, i.e. Singapore, but you also may believe that being able to drink on the streets and having more freedom is better, and are willing to deal with more crime, i.e. in Eastern Europe. What matters is the input and the quantity of this input. Democracy isn't actually representative, or just if it doesn't engage in these issues that people often care about. It isn't fair for opposition to just go like, no, but we would prefer a lot of minority investment, and that is the only thing that the right doesn't do. What do we show you under this? Two things. One, the political rhetoric is significantly more moderated on our side of the house. By the way, no response from OO. Second, that Ryan tells you how you decrease radical discourse because politicians are not doubling down to try and prove their point. But additionally, here's the mechanism I want to give. It is not just about being radical on one issue, it's about radicalizing on other issues you previously may not have a stance on. So for example, if you are someone who likes Macron's tax policies, but you don't really care about immigration issues, but you watch the TF1 in France, you hear relatively convincing rhetoric about how the Arab immigrants are stealing your jobs and that they're dangerous and they're potentially terrorists. Sooner or later, you realize you are stuck in this far-right echo chamber on their side, you buy into anti-immigrant narratives and policies that are anti-Muslim. So you get radicalized on stances that you previously didn't really have one on, which is why it's significantly more harmful on their side. The CO response is, no, but being moderate means you are less representative, but we get better representation for two reasons. One, trivially, most people have pretty moderate political views. Most people don't want radical change. If political institutions are centrist and moderate, then the largest number of people's views are represented. Yes, the leftist extremes may be ignored, but we benefit the largest number of people by giving them more representative institutions. Two, you get more buy-in in democratic institutions because people are often scared of the other extreme. So what that extreme has less influence in politics, people are more willing to give power to governments on our side of the house.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech, and I call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to close out the top half of this debate. Hear, hear.
Hi, I'll take my POS in the chat, probably from closing government for engagement purposes. Also, hi, Mosey. Nice to see you. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 things in this speech. First, framing relative to the material in OG. Second, additional responses to OG. Finally, why we are debate winning. So first, framing relative to the material in OG. They say that under our side of the house, people are not going to vote, that they're going to abandon politics because they feel excluded, but will feel included under centrist politics. What we suggest is that voters are more likely to be disillusioned under their side, because I agree with PM that centrist politics will strive for stability. They will strive for maintaining the status quo because stability means maintaining what we presently consider normal and comfortable. So even if you don't believe the 4 structural reasons that Yeonwooh gave you for why conservatism is closer to the norm than any leftist ideology that they concede is morally good, it is more likely that their form of centrism looks like the present US politics in their pursuit of bipartisanship, right? Where they will compromise through A, satisfying the broad voter demographic that is the most numerate and most powerful, like your majoritarian races and religions, meaning that social wage issue policies on things like abortion or things like protester protections are less likely to pass, given that politicians under their side of the house still have the incentive of winning over these individuals. They can shape their rhetoric to cater towards these individuals by changing the types of policies that they are likely to push. Under our side of the house, you have parties that form on the basis of being directly opposed to supporting this type of status quo that minority demographics need. But secondly, in terms of legislative policy reform, it is more likely to look like filibusters because your politician can just weaponize their rhetoric by saying that we prioritize meeting concessions from both sides. We understand that your people are fucking dying due to not getting medicine or are going bankrupt because their private healthcare bills and insurance premiums are too expensive, but we cannot reach a middle ground that is fair to our taxpayers in order to defend their rich corporate donors. Therefore, we cannot meet a middle ground and cannot reform this particular policy. This means their policy concessions are likely to be ineffective and are unlikely to happen in ways that progressively reform status quo structures, which we consider is necessary. I have 4 additional responses to OG. The first is, they say that no one knows what the objective sets of policies that are good are. Sure, I might not know what the best types of policies are, but I'm able to identify that there are harmful ideologies that ought to be combated. And in order for you to combat those harmful structures, you need to adopt structures or ideologies that are considered radical in the status quo. Organizations like Antifa or ideologies like cancel culture are considered radical by many normal people. Things like socialized healthcare in the US is considered a radical shift in policy. Underpinning this, I want you to note that they don't even meet their own criteria of, quote, not knowing what the perfect policy is, therefore the opinion of everyone is important. Because Muzi is correct to POI. In the 4th minute of PM's speech, you hear them say that you need to minimize the splintering or polarization of political parties or movements. Only one of these 2 things can be true, right? You can either prioritize unique perspectives on policies and ideology being important, therefore promote the existence of varying ideologies, and therefore protect certain types of ideologies because you view the suppression of this as bad, or you prioritize the center of all types of ideologies and you do not suppress policy positions that are harmful towards the expression of these minority groups. The moral calculus that you make is different under their side of the house because they provide legitimacy to all criteria of ideology without logical reasonings for why it is true that these things are things we should care about. The second response is on when they say that there's an echo chamber. It's not like they get to brainwash everyone to become political centrists, right? They just promote policy discussions, narratives, and concessions by social movements to be centrist. This doesn't mean that people who adopt this particular type of policy position is going to have the same moral calculus and moral positions as this opening government team. The third response is on the types of policies that they talk about. What we suggest is that it's unlikely to tackle the core of the issue due to the concessions that happen because politicians are able to scapegoat discussions on this. Lastly, there are structural reasons for why they would maintain harmful policies like genocide that DPM talks about. For instance, most conflict in history are done for resources rather than ideology. They can just weaponize whichever political lens that they adopt under Gov to continue these oppressive actions anyway. Even if you don't believe this, and you believe their government and policies are considered perfect, why do we win over them? The first is that norms change over time with the development of social interaction that leads to the development of norms that diverge from what we consider traditional. Secondly, that preferences develop with technology, innovation, and culture, meaning that radical voices for changes that are not not silenced by a false idea of center being what is reasonable is good. This is important because you need to contest the state, because the state has power over you in terms of their monopoly on violence. They collect money from you through taxes and they exercise this monopoly on violence with that money, which means that even if our world is one where it is very polarized, it means that there is constant accountability for states, as there is always a party that is in opposition to your political dominant party, which means even if they get the perfect social democratic state, creating divergent schools of thought that criticize the efficacy of what is already really good policies is important for you to help more people, which means we produce more utility if the world looks like their best case scenario. The final thing I'm going to talk about is why we are debate winning. But before that, I'll take CG.
Okay, let's take both sides at their best, which is that in OO, I'll assume that you get ideological purity without compromise in political positions. But in OG, maybe you achieve some compromise. The question then is why some moderate policy is worse than having constant gridlock over policy directions between major parties.
Because I told you what the types of moderate policies you are likely to pass is. It is not going to be any policy that reforms the status quo. Your politicians can just weaponize this to use it as an excuse on the veil of trying to reach a middle ground, therefore not reform the present society. But also, Yeonwooh gave an entire speech proving to you what the status quo is and what your centrist politics is likely to look like anyway, which is harmful things. What we prove is that supporting the status quo leaves very little room for drastic reform that is necessary, because political centrism means censorship of radical perspectives even if they are morally preferable, because they are not comfortable for most people. Additionally, that there will be a lack of suppression for opinions that are harmful towards these minority opinions, because it is considered as normal to suppress these particular types of opinions because it is considered as radical. It is necessary for you, therefore, to pick a side, for you to be able to analyze situations better for the process of reform by having distinct differences of who is considered bad, what type of policy creates evil outcomes, etc., between different ideological groups and preferences. And finally, because it prevents minority suppression, because you do not view both groups of people in a conflict as morally equivalent, therefore necessary to be able to reach a middle ground. There is no centrism to slavery. There is no centrism to people dying from not getting fucking medicine. For these reasons, we are proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for that fine speech, and I thank the top half for what has been an engaging debate thus far. To open up the second half of this debate, I call upon the Member of Government. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yes.
Starting my, sorry, give me a second. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think the missing thing that in OG, and that we're going to demonstrate today, is why you're actually able to get long-lasting social change. Because the main push we get down there is that you're not going to get left-wing stuff at all. We're going to explain that even if it's left-wing or right-wing, why social change does occur, and why this is likely to be more cemented at the point at which it comes on the basis of consensus. I'm going to explain and mechanize that, right? And along the way, I'll integrate some rebuttals to the vast amount of the OO case. So first of all, what is this argument? What's it about, right? Fundamentally, what we changed from OT is because they attribute this argument about stability and long-run changes to extremism. They explain the negative case of why extremism is unlikely to result in long-run changes. So we're going to explain to you the positive reasons for why changes will be long-lasting, why they're likely to exist in the first place, and how the ways in which they exist by explaining to you the politician's incentive under a world with this kind of ideology. So first of all, right, in the counterfactual world, where you have, for example, like the status quo and lots of this kind of mudslinging, etc., governments are likely to pass policies or stand for policies that are directly opposed to each other. That oftentimes means, like during elections, governments campaign about things about how you want to reverse promises of other parties and etc. I want to change and correct the legacies of other parties. Why is this the case? There are a couple of reasons, right? First of all, because you want to be accredited for a certain policy objective and achieving a certain goal, right? The point at which another party who is opposite to you does that, you lose a way in which to claim something. That means you often lost this thing already, so you want to correct for that legacy, right? But second of all, even if you don't want to correct it in the sense of reversing the entire policy, you just want to get your own policy in place so you can get credit for that as well. So that's your project and not theirs. These things change fundamentally when the incentive doesn't exist, insofar as these things are negotiated ahead of time. That is to say that if the policy that was already put in place was done by consensus, neither party can lay a claim to, for example, me pushing the whole thing because it was a collective project by both sides, right? What does it look like, therefore, in the status quo? It looks like things, for example, Obama tried to remove Obamacare, not because, for example, he's a genius who wants to propose another policy, because one, he wants a Republican version of it, or two, even if he doesn't, he's just evil and wants to make sure that Democrats don't get a win in this aspect, right? So this is the incentive analysis that we have here, right? But more importantly, right, these kinds of changes are also not legitimate, insofar as trying to reverse a change oftentimes means that you're only representing a certain portion of society who wants to reverse this change. So even by O at their highest, right, that's to say that you believe that, okay, great, that a bunch of liberals want to like change the world for better. Only a small portion of that society wants to do so in the short run, right? They want to change it for whatever reasons. And we don't believe that's legitimate to impose on the rest of society. But okay, let's explain, therefore, why we get incremental changes. And I'm going to explain also why the politicians have decided to do so. O is right? They tell you that, look, there's a bunch of political issues, like slavery is not something you can centrist about. Exactly. Which is why these are certain things that just don't become an issue for politicians, right? They don't bother squabbling about it because it's no longer an issue, right? Like healthcare is not being politicized like COVID was in America because the rest of the fucking world also realized it's a simple thing to take a vaccine, right? The reason that you don't have polarization, and the point at which you don't have polarization, the point at which these things are obvious and centrist and easy for either to agree, just becomes non-issues inside a political debate. That's the first thing that we're going to give you that's new for opening half. But second of all, right, politicians fundamentally change their incentives in the way in which they engage in policies. Why? Because parties themselves become less important. Because instead of having parties stand for a huge line of the left or the right, you now as an individual politician have to demonstrate your own self-worth inside parliament. What does this look like? It means, for example, trying to pass bills and put your name on them. It means they're trying to tell everybody that in your constituency that I actually have done something in this way and contributed to this discourse, right? How does this change, therefore? It means that, for example, you also have people like suggesting new ideas and they're pushing the fold as individual political actors inside this world of ideology, right? And why will they do this? Because they have census data, right? Politicians take ideas not by themselves, because they have census data from wherever, they have analytics, they have academic views to support all these things, right? All it suggests that long-run changes that are more moderate and move along the way will happen anyways under our system, insofar as individual politicians have a greater incentive to do so, and they're not stuck by party whips for suggesting ideas that break with them. This also means that at the same time, the parties will willing to listen to you. That means instead of dismissing Joe Manchin because AOC is currently in charge, you have to listen to him because you realize that we're moving towards a centrist direction, and everybody's viewpoint is legitimate and something that we can hold together as a party as a whole, right? But another reason why this is important, right, is it also means that you have a pressure. Because if you're the individual politician who is filibustering and stalling, you are the one who's derailing the entire government on this specific point, right? And that's where you actually become in trouble and you get blamed for all these issues that happens, especially when a large majority on either side or multiple political parties are willing to support this current project, right? That is to say that Obamacare is vastly popular in Congress, but you're part of the 5 people who are disagreeing with it. You're under hot shit to explain why. Otherwise, you're in deep trouble when it comes down to your political election next time, right? And that's what changes the point at which you get this kind of centrism in society, right? And O tells you like this, look, we get filibuster, and that's going to be far worse on our side. We only this is the case for a couple of reasons, right? Firstly, because in our world, there's a race to negotiate. There's a race to be the one that comes out as the one that's most willing to compromise and most willing to actually get things done and be an effective government, because that's what gives you legitimacy and votes. In their world, you have a race to win by making the other side lose. Insofar as they fucking lose, you win, regardless of whether or not the government is stalled, regardless if it goes into shutdown. Because as long as you delay their attacks, that's the point at which you get any sort of solvency on your side, right? We change this calculus to the point at which you have this ideology behind you, where what you're focusing on is trying to get your name in charge of winning in terms of making sure that the policy actually passes in the first place. That's why we think that we're going to let incremental changes in this way. But more importantly, here's a missing link on opening half as well, right? We actually make sure these changes actually stick on the ground. Why is this the case? Because first of all, the political cost of changing this policy is extremely high. Because now, for example, because 2 parties or 3 parties or a large majority of parties voted for this, because they use census data to back it up, they're unlikely to change it. That is to say, in a world where you pass moderate gun laws by a majority of both sides of the US Congress, the next party is unlikely to be able to change this, the point at which they realize that their own party members have actually voted for this in the past. That is fundamentally different in their world, where even if you get radical changes, and we admit, sure, if O is correct, you get small, moderate changes, you don't think it reverse at any point in time, right? And you get no stability in that regard. This also means that, for example, negotiations themselves rely on statistics and census data, right? And instead of people just being left behind these policies to get included in this, and because individuals have already been voted for this and they get reelected, they're likely to also stop the change. I'll take a PI from OO.
So why is it that only 5 politicians will disagree with Medicare reform, rather than most politicians disagreeing with it as they get donations from medical companies? How do you resist this?
Buddy. If they do get voted, have like a bunch of these people politicking you and like paying money, that will happen on either side, right? It gets stalled either ways. What I'm trying to explain to you is that in this case, people are still shown that if they are the ones stalling, even the large majority of them, right? Then this issue maybe takes like more time to discuss. And let's do this way up, right? Even if we get slow changes, why is this so much better? And I'm going to give you the example of Roe v. Wade, right? Because in that circumstance, where changes can rapidly change, people cannot plan their lives properly. We're talking not just about social changes, but economic changes as well, right? But the point in which at any point in time, you can wake up the next morning and your rights to exist have evaporated. That is the point we posit to you. Society is far worse for everyone living under it, right? So even if we agree and we bite to all the harms of opposition, the point in which these changes don't actually stick. And even though you'll get the smallest of changes, the fact that they remain and your rights actually increase is so much better for an individual to plan your lives and live a meaningful existence. If at any point in time your existence can be invalidated by a party who doesn't like you, right? That's far worse on all the sides on their side of the house, right? Because we have these kind of paper rights can be changed by courts and judges, etc. That's where everything becomes far worse because you have no stability and no certainty to actually try and do things. But last of all, right, because you waste a lot of resources trying to change policies, right? Governments have to reshuffle, civil servants have to change their priorities, and all these are massively wasteful insofar as you're trying to reverse old policies. For all those reasons, we're so proud of this.
I thank the member of government for that fine speech, and I call upon the member of the opposition to continue the case on off bench. Hear, hear.
Am I audible and visible?
Yes to both.
I don't think the biggest problems that democracies have to solve is what opening government says, which is just to aggregate the preferences of the voters that exist in these places. Because if this is the case, we could just hold a referenda for every contentious issue and get people's preferences on these things. I think the largest problem that democracies have to solve is that of preference construction. That is to say, people in democracies don't know what they want and don't understand what policy implications can be on them. The reason the democratic policy process is so valuable is because it allows massive amounts of debate and discourse to occur for different ideas to battle it out in massive amounts of debate and discourse in the world, which tell people and help them understand what they want, understand what kinds of policies that they are willing to accept and what they're not willing to accept, and make sure that they can shape their malleable beliefs to what they exactly want out of politicians. We think the process of elections and the process of a democracy is key to doing this kind of thing, and we only get that on our side of the house. 3 pieces of extension. Firstly, about the apathy amongst voters that occurs on their side of the house. This is directly responsive to the OG principle, because OG says that they get more engaged politicians, more engaged voters on their side of the house. I don't think this is the case. The simple warrant here is that, look, different people and countries have vastly different experiences, right? We think the vast majority of states have extremely diverse populations, but there is diversity in class and massive amounts of inequality in people who are rich and different poor, having different political beliefs, of rural and urban people who work different kinds of jobs, having different political beliefs. And in the example of post-colonial states, having vast majority of different ethnicities with different priorities and different historical baggages that they're carrying, having very different kinds of preferences in the first place. This means that people on their side of the house don't feel represented by the centrist politics in the first place, right? Because it's likely to be just representative for the dominant majority party or the people who are in the median vote. It doesn't matter if that ends up being the policy passed in the place, because the people who turn out to vote on their side of the house are far fewer. This looks like people like Trump, who spoke to the anti-immigrant heart of the people in America who were afraid of immigrants taking away their jobs, and made sure that he got massive amounts of turnouts from the extreme right. And similarly from Bernie Sanders, who spoke about healthcare and other issues that mattered to the American left and got these people to turn out. It doesn't matter if in the end the person who is elected ends up being Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden. The point is that these people turned out to vote in the first place, were engaged with the political process and made their beliefs heard because they felt represented by different parts of the political spectrum. This only happens on closing opposition when we tell them. Why is this argument important in this debate? Because firstly, notice this is a principled harm, right? This is a principled harm when people don't vote in elections. Because insofar as the state has total monopoly of violence over you, we think it is extremely valuable that people show up to these elections and vote. But I don't even have to do this, because opening government concedes in their first argument that people turning out to vote is a very important thing in this debate, and thus we should have less echo chambers and people turning out and people feeling heard. We think this is conceded to by opening government. We get that better on closing opposition. The second argument we have about why we get worse policy. Note that there is no experimentation on the side of government, right? Because you get no interesting new solutions coming up on their side of the house, because the process of democratic finding and compromise doesn't occur in the first place, because there is no incentive for a party to create a new policy, because they have no incentive to seek out new kinds of votes, to represent and voice out different opinions, or in the case that debates and discussions happen, to come to different types of conclusions and different types of centrist compromises which are different from the ones that happen on their side of the house. This is where I explicitly get into what the comparative is, because I think opening government is really uncharitable when they say that, hey, look, no policy will be passed. Here is how policy is passed in our world, right? Because we get different kinds of coalitions formed. So, for example, in India, you have a parliamentary democracy where you have parties like the Communist Party of India, which is a Marxist party, extremely left, also aligning with the center-left Congress to get their ideology passed together in national coalition. This means that the coalitions look different in our side of the house, but they aren't bipartisan in the same way or like on different sides of the spectrum, but rather are between different sides of the same spectrum on single issues that don't translate into other issues on our side of the house. This means that you still manage to get policies passed, but the kinds of policies passed in the coalition building process is far more democratic and far more representative of what each individual person actually believes on a single policy issue, rather than their side of the house, where people are expected to vote for one or two parties and have that represent all of their political beliefs rather than just individual political beliefs, which means we're better able to represent single issue and double issue voters, which we think are extremely valuable. Secondly, I think we flip the CG extension, right? The CG extension is, hey, look, it means that some things should be like the crises are better dealt with by politics, social change is better dealt with by politics. I think on our side of the house, you leave some things apart from politics, right? Things like COVID-19 crisis planning don't become politicized on our side of the house because no one trusts an extremely politically diverse set of views to take care of this. Note that the comparative is that it's taken care of people like bureaucrats and things like that, which means that people are more likely to have consistent policy, which is better than their side, which is centrist politics, which still is like more work than bureaucrats doing this on our side of the house. Why does this beat opening opposition? Because we agree with opening opposition that the policy that is passed on their side of the house is bad, but it's not bad because policy is centrism is some sort of right-wing policy in disguise. It is bad because it is uncreative, because new ideas never come to the fore and new kinds of voters are never engaged with. I'll take OG.
So even if you're right that different voters have different preferences, most voters do have somewhat moderate beliefs in as much as their status quo bias, and centrist parties under our side can still have different factions.
This is just an assertion. I think the diversity of human experience means that this most people have moderate beliefs is not true. I think people have vastly different beliefs on various different issues, which means that even if I'm moderate on the whole, I have very extreme views about certain different kinds of political ideas. And I think that is also worth representing in the political process. But lastly, I think on our side of the house, we get better policy because you seek out new demographics, right? So this looks like, for example, people making politics that seeks out new voter bases, because on their side of the house, you don't just have to win the median voter. It is also a viable political strategy to win a small faction and try to lead a coalition, as Ryan himself concedes in Prime Minister. This means that it looks like people looking to give the right to vote to people like prisoners and find other new political entities, which means that you get more representation and an expansion of democracy on our side of the house. But lastly, we get better accountability. OO mentions this, we'll have better mechanisms. Firstly, you get more checks and balances that are built into the legal systems of these countries. Why is this the case? Because if you're afraid of other parties, if you think the other parties are diametrically opposed to what you think is acceptable political belief, you're likely to compromise and give up your own political power so that they can't do bad things with this. This means that you mean that the legislative bodies get massive judicial checks placed on them and massive democratic institutional checks placed on them on the things like the right to vote, which people agree are extremely important, and give up their own right to abuse this because they're afraid the other party might abuse it worse than them, which means you get far better institutional protection and get far less democratic backsliding on our side of the house because you're afraid that other parties will do the same thing, even worse, which means you get far more accountability and democratic protection and less backsliding on our side of the house. Proud to stand in closing government opposition.
I thank the member of the opposition for that fine speech, and to conclude this debate on side proposition, I call upon the government whip. Hear.
Sorry, can I check if I'm audible? Okay, I'm a bit sick, so if you hear someone sounds really nasal, it's me. I'm really sorry. I'll try to make myself audible. And let my POIs exclusively in the chat, please. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 things in this speech. First, I want to do a CO to take them out of this debate. Secondly, I want to weigh Burns' material against opening half. And then lastly, responses to OO. First things first, CO. CO's main thrust of their case is that they get voter apathy, which is problematic because right from the get-go, you exclude individuals from the political process. A couple of responses to this. Firstly, I think it still stems from a fundamental misconception of Odd Bench about what exactly political centrism looks like on the ground. It is not the case that political centrism suddenly means that you have no unique policy platform, that you have no ability to campaign. Rather, I think it's that you still have policy changes, just that your politicians enter parliament with the intention of arriving at the most ideal median solution rather than insisting on their own policy platforms at all costs. What does this look like? This looks like, for instance, the amount of votes that party gets tells them to gives them an indication of what extent of compromises they're willing to accept. So if you have very few individuals voting for a specific policy platform, you're unlikely to push for that policy as hard as you would as if a lot of voters were supporting you on that specific policy platform. So it's not the case that you entirely lose campaigning and the ability to stand as a distinct party. But the second response to this is that I don't actually think this is mutually exclusive. So at best, this claim is a wash. And the reason for this is that people oftentimes choose not to vote when they are disillusioned. And the reason why individuals are disillusioned is when they feel that their vote leads to no differences. And the reason why this is important is because Byrne explains to you that the incentives of parties when they enter a political negotiation setting, just fundamentally believing that they have diametrically opposed ideals and that they do not need to arrive at a compromise, that's the precise moment at which you don't have any incentive to actually arrive at a policy conclusion. And the reason why this is important is because when people feel that their votes don't actually translate into policy changes, that's when they choose not to vote. The comparative in our world is that you're more likely to vote when you know that your vote is able to dictate and tell a party how much to compromise or when to compromise. But more importantly, I want to flip this point, which is that I think the idea of vulnerable voters feeling apathetic is worse on opposition. When Byrne explains to you that the ability for individual politicians to have more power, to have broken free of the party whip, for instance, means that you get more grassroots initiatives and more ideas of politics that stem from the lived experiences of individuals on the ground. This is precisely what increases political engagement to begin with. So I think that undermines CO's point right at its root. Then after that, member op says, but you won't get any interesting solutions. Firstly, what? I've never understood why politics has to be about interesting solutions if interesting solutions necessarily means you pushing through your policy at the expense of everyone else's interest. The comparative in our world is this. Maybe we do have boring changes. Maybe we do have very small changes, but those are going to be incremental changes that you know for a fact will stick and will last. And the reason why this is important is I think even though this ends up in the same general direction as OG, Byrne actually mechanizes this claim to explain why you get more stable and more incremental changes. The reason why this is important is this, right? If OO and CO are correct to say that there are so many differing policy views in society that you oftentimes cannot arrive at an amenable conclusion, then it certainly is the case that you will never achieve the fullest extent possible of the policy changes that you are voting for. So the best possible alternative that individuals can go for is incremental changes. So for instance, if I'm a racial minority in a country that's heavily dominated by a certain ethnic group, I will never expect that my group will become the majority or that I will suddenly come to power. What I want is those incremental changes, and I want to know that those incremental changes are solidified and that they cannot be eroded by subsequent governments. This is something you only ever get in OG, in CG, where all these benefits are always formed by compromise rather than by one party pushing it through at the expense of the other, because they always have to risk the idea that it will be politically expedient for the subsequent government in their world to come in and undermine those changes. I think that's an important mechanism that CO is missing that takes them out of this debate. Lastly, they talk about single issue voters and about how we alienate them. I think if anything, this falls into the previous frame, which is that political centrism helps you to resolve deadlocks even in single issues. So if you're talking about single issue voters who want to see changes in a specific policy platform, we're the ones who get there. I think we win even on that metric. Secondly, Byrne's material and why I think it takes us above OG. OG basically says you get increased discourse and increased stability in policy making due to compromise. I think it's vulnerable to this correct CO response, which is that policy is likely to still be passed either ways via coalition. So I think the real question here that Byrne answers is what kinds of policy is being passed, who passes those policies. To that end, Byrne explains to you three things, right? Firstly, that the ability to arrive at a centrist argument necessarily means that you get more grassroots involvement in politics rather than having to follow your whip. And the reason why this is important is because this accounts for CO's analysis about how different individuals have different human experiences, which is why they want to vote for different parties in the first place, which is that if it is the case that human experiences are so varied and so diversified, then the way in which we win is by proving that all of these varied human experiences can be represented in the political spectrum in the first place. This explains why, even before entering the process, politics itself becomes more diversified. You enable more views to be materialized at the discussion phase. Even if this doesn't lead to the optimal policy changes, so even if you don't get 100% of the policy changes you want, you only get 60%, this is still good because the sheer ability to present those arguments in a parliamentary platform means that it is written down. It means that subsequent parties have every incentive to cater to that specific argument because they know that it's an ongoing concern within their demographic. But secondly, and more importantly, is that Byrne explains to you that the incentive of pure political opposition is diametrically opposed to the incentive of society at large. And this gives you the most reasonable analysis in the debate, which is that politicians will always try to win at all costs. They will try to politicize things even when there's a clear policy platform. So in the instance of COVID, oftentimes politicians were trying to fan the flames over COVID because it was like politically expedient for them to appeal to their base. The comparative is that centrism always forces you to go to the most reasonable solution. It forces you to align yourself with the incentives of society rather than the incentives of winning a political election, which oftentimes are diametrically opposed. And therefore, I think this is what helps us to explain why politics becomes better and more representative before that.
So your member response to filibusters is that people will protest the state. So it seems to me that your end outcome is for a bunch of people to lobby against the status quo of the state. The motion doesn't say politicians, it says the dominant political ideology, which most people subscribe to.
Got it. So I listened to Byrne's speech, don't think he actually said that. Even if that's the case, I don't actually think it's the case that the optimal solution we're going for is for people to lobby the state. What we're arguing is that you get more people involved in the political process by having people having one, grassroots involvement in politics, and two, having your interests being reflected on the policy platform. That's the kind of involvement that we go for that you uniquely exclude in your world. Thirdly, we explain that we get more lasting and incremental changes. And the reason why this outweighs OG is because OG might be right that you get more discourse, OG might be right that you get more stable policy making, but they don't actually explain or impact this. And the only mechanism for this comes out in Byrne's speech when he explains to you that subsequent parties have every incentive to consistently build upon decades of compromise achieved in the past. And this is the way in which you get radical changes over time. So if CO and OO are correct to suggest that there's some major flaw in society that has to be fixed, to the extent that these are flaws that are unlikely to ever be fixed in a single lifetime, incremental changes are the only way you get there. And the only way you get there is if you have centrism. Lastly, OO basically says accountability. But firstly, I would note that the only reason why accountability is important is because we believe that people should be able to vote and see changes based on the reflection of their vote. That only happens in our world. Incredibly proud to propose CG.
I thank the government whip for that fine speech, and to close out this debate on side opposition and indeed as a whole, I call upon the opposition whip. Here.
Cool. Can you hear me? 3, 2, 1. Engaging with closing government for our extinction, defending it, then closing government and opening government, and finally weighing against opening opposition. I just want to say this broadly now, in the vast majority of instances, the reason you engage with politics is not because I really love politics. Politics is quite dry. Most people engage with it because they get to see dramatic stuff. They get to see Hillary Clinton and Trump debate on television. They get to see the kinds of policies where they strongly believe in a particular ideology and see it represented on a particular screen on national television. Note what this means. In the vast majority of instances, the reason I want to support policies in our world is likely because you actively feel that these are important things to you, that they are things that represent you to the highest level possible, and therefore you're massively galvanized to engage in them. Closing government says two things in response to this. The first thing they say is, but guys, you can still push policy in our world. This doesn't actually deal with the mechanism that Rohan gave you, which was not that people don't push policy in government world, but rather that you don't feel fundamentally interconnected to this policy. You haven't been told that this is a major part of your life. You don't have that ideological belief that leftism or rightism is something that you need to support, and therefore you aren't necessarily galvanized to engage in this. But secondly, obviously, without the massive push from parties, without the push that you want to include new individuals, and the fact that there exists a narrative that tells you, hey, you have to do this because this is good for our system, that you have to engage in your particular policy, you won't actively go out to vote to the same extent because you don't feel that same responsibility, especially at the point where centrism broadly says you shouldn't really be rocking the boat. It's just something to be passing off in terms of the status quo. Their second response is, but guys, these are already vulnerable individuals and that these people wouldn't break out on either side of the house. Two things to note here. Firstly, obviously, on our side of the house, the point where more leftist and different parties break down, there is often niches that different parties want to cater to. This is exactly why Bernie Sanders caters to blue-collar workers, or why you have specific parties that cater to African Americans or small minorities in places like India and Pakistan, where you have parties for the Pashtuns in particular. Note what this means. This is uniquely likely in our world because you often represent different parts of the ideological spectrum to a very large extent, which often cater to particular niches. That means that you often galvanize those individuals because they uniquely see a reflection of themselves. They see themselves on television and representation and are likely feeling to be significantly more included within the political system. This deals with the closing government response in two ways. One, even if CG was right that there are other incentives to pass policy, they don't actually engage with the fundamental mechanism, which was that people have significantly more interest. But secondly, obviously we pinpoint why it's likely that they have more individuals wanting to engage with these policies at the point where there's a plurality of parties on the comparative. The second response, the second claim that we made in extension, which gets rebutted, is, guys, you don't get interesting solutions, and that interesting solutions are bad because you don't have all those kind of things. Three things to note here. Firstly, obviously, this is like a very strawman-y version of the response, right? When you have different types of policies that are not centrist, the reason why you get better solutions is because you have significantly more granularity in the policy. Note what this means. This means you have several more parties that push different types of platforms, and therefore you're significantly more likely in our world to be crafting these types of policy to a much larger extent. Secondly, though, we just do think that this means different people have different clashes over policy. This is particularly relevant because this means that you're much more likely in our world to have policies being pushed to a larger extent. The only claim here then is, but guys, it leads to radicalization and gridlock. They don't actually deal with the extension here, which is that radicalization and gridlock is actually pretty great in two ways. One, you obviously get significantly more critique for other parties. Note what this means. This means when I am radicalized, when I really hate the other party, I scrutinize them to a much larger extent. Each and every one of my constituents is looking at them like a hawk. And so at the point where they make any bad mistakes, it is significantly less likely that they get corruption and other forms of systemic problems within the entire place. But secondly, you just get better call-outs. You reduce things like corporate lobbying to a much larger extent, which means that you get more transparent political systems within our world, even if they are more radicalized. We think this is more important because obviously you don't know the objective good that policy has, but at the point where policy is passed, it's implemented to a much larger and better extent within our world. The last claim they make is, but guys, you're not going to get optimal policy platforms on their side of the house and then you're going to compromise either way. Two things to note. One, obviously compromise is largely symmetric, and I'm going to deal with opening government here. But like, secondly, we just get better representation through a different lens of the political spectrum. Okay, given this, weighing against CG and dealing with them in two ways. One, even if closing government is entirely correct, where their entire case is absolutely true, two issues. One, it's very unclear what they actually contribute from opening government, which is like the first problem that I think I have with them. But secondly, even if they were to have like political cost of imposing policy and that these policies are not very hard to overturn, one, you also increase the cost of imposing policy. So to pass this policy in the first place is a lot harder because you cannot rock the boat. Secondly, though, even if they're right about your party whip no longer being able to control you, it's often seen as significantly worse within their world, right? Because obviously you still want to compromise in order to reach success. That means you never try to cater to your grassroots constituents because it's seen as rocking the boat. You want to always have policies that cater to a broad base of individuals, and therefore you don't engage in these to their extent. Dealing with opening government then, which I think is the broad majority of the debate. Two things that opening government basically says. Firstly, they say centrism doesn't actually represent people. Here's the problem. They never tell you why non-centrist policies actually represent people, and we gave you three reasons why they don't. One, obviously if you have centrist policies, then you likely have large parties that dominate the political spectrum. That means that you often get one or two parties under which you get significant coalition of power. This is why you end up getting big parties that often try to galvanize and have significant numbers of individuals. Secondly, though, we told you it's significantly likely in our world that you just do not get access in their side to the comparative change, i.e. you're very unlikely to get accountability given the extension that we gave you. Opening government before I go for it.
Your argument is that new radical ideas combat apathy and improve policy, but most of those ideas rarely get passed into policy either because of gridlock or they immediately get repealed by the next extreme government to come into power.
Yeah, here's the thing. At the point where we get these individuals more involved, two things happen. One, they become a stable electoral vote. This is how African Americans got transformed into a large swing vote, and therefore you weren't able to repeal the policies that they wanted. So it's important to get a foot within the door. Secondly, though, I don't care if policy gets repealed or what. Like at the point where you win an election, we think the government has a right to repeal this policy. It's fine if they're slightly more extreme. I would rather have a more representative government than a government that passes more stable policy, but doesn't have many individuals actively wanting to engage in this. The last thing then is just weighing against opening government. Look, Their best case is you get some stable policy. This stable policy is actually quite bad. Firstly, because in most instances, it's really easy to be unaccountable, right? All politicians want to engage in less accountable measures on their side of the house because you can often engage in corporate stuff, but also because you're not critiqued to the same extent. Secondly, though, even in their best case, where you get better policy paths, the problem is that you don't actually represent individuals. On our side, given that we actually include more people in the political spectrum, this is more important in their case because representation is the fundamental part of democracy. Third, better policies, and we get better ideas within our side. I'm very proud to oppose.
I thank the operator for that very fine speech, and indeed all of